The lecture 2, Urban Crisis. The term of urban crisis emerged in the United States in the 50s, but in Europe the urban crisis has been affecting the years 70s and 80s. The urban crisis concerns many aspects of urban reality, such as desindustrialization, the fall of quality of life, suburbanization, rising inequality and segregation, gentrification, and etc. European cities since Industrial Revolution grew mostly thanks to industry. Industrial plants gives a job and attract to settle down new inhabitants, and what is very important, factories were also generator of social and cultural social capital and social identity for these people. Therefore, closing industrial plants resulting not only in unemployment but also in social disorganization and leading to serious social problems. At the same time, when the industrialization process was taking place, European cities struggled with fiscal crisis as a consequence of the decline of welfare states. These processes affected the falling of public services. As a consequence of this, the decrease of quality of life in cities. Cities become less attractive and safe because many social problems such as crime, drug addiction and alcoholism, segregation and ghettoization. All these processes led to the decline of city centers and consequently stimulated processes of suburbanization and or desindustrialization. Suburbanization. Suburbanization is not a new phenomenon. Historical examples of suburbanization we can find in ancient times, but for a long time it was a privilege just only narrow elites. Suburbanization has become the experiences of the masses relatively recently, in the middle of the 20th century. It happens thanks to three factors. Firstly, mass production of cars allowing for individual commuting to the city center. Second, widespread access to home loan, allowing not only the elite to buy their own home, but also every middle class member to buy it. And thirdly, cheap prefabricated construction, allowing for mass production of cheap houses. Suburbanization started in the USA and relatively quickly also reached Europe as a consequence of the spread of American pattern of culture, also described by slogan of American Dream, symbolized by a little suburban house with garden and at least 2 family cars. For cities, suburbanization contributes to many negative processes. First of all, is the fact that to the suburbs, moving out mainly middle class, the best taxpayer and consumers. Such situation stimulate fiscal crisis, decline service even more. Secondly, people from suburbs are dependent on car in their everyday life. Therefore, sprawl cities means also jammed cities and air-polluted cities. Thirdly, suburbanization also causes serious problem for local democracy, undermines social capital and civic involvements. This problem was described by, for example, for Robert Putnam in his seminal book Bowling Alone. Shrinking cities. Suburbanization is dysfunctional for cities for many reasons, but people from suburbs still using the city. They work in the city, they consume city services, doing shopping, etc. The real crisis, the real urban crisis, led to the phenomenon of shrinking cities, the population cities and their metropolitan area. As a consequence of desindustrialization, fallen of quality of life and security. Symbolic example of such shrinking cities became Detroit, which has shrunk almost 3 times for nearly 2 million residents in 1950 to less than 700,000 today. The problem of Detroit has been analyzed, among others, in such books as The Origin of the Urban Crisis, and especially by Charlie LeDuff in his high-profile reportage book Detroit: An American Autopsy. Problem of shrinking city is especially important in post-socialistic city in Central and Eastern Europe. Many cities in this region were dominated by industrial monoculture. After the transition, 1989, and the industrialization, they faced serious economic and social problem, which resulted in intensive process of depopulation. 2 examples from Poland could be a good example of this situation. Łódź, who was called Polish Manchester, for decades was the second largest, the biggest city in Poland. But after transition, Łódź they lost their population and started to be called Polish Detroit. In fact, Łódź after transition lost nearly 200,000 residents, which represent 20% of total population. Another example is Katowice, the capital of Silesia region, the most urbanized and industrialized region in Poland. Katowice has lost nearly 30% of their inhabitants after transition. Segregation. Urban crises manifested themselves also by such phenomenon as rising of social and economic inequality, segregation and ghettoization, which was correlated with decline of the welfare state. Such model of state, for many reasons, has declined in the 70s, and the consequence of this was rising of social and economic inequality, segregation and ghettoization. Gated community became a symbol of segregation in a contemporary city. Gated communities is residential area that are surrounded by fences, walls or other barriers, restricting access through the security devices and security guards. Development of gated communities was the result of ongoing privatization of public services under the new neoliberal urban policies. Gentrification. Neoliberal policies led also to gentrification of cities. Originally, this process of gentrification was described by Ruth Glass in the early 60s in his book London, Aspect of Change. Gentrification is most often defined as a process of neighborhood change that includes economic and social culture changes in this process. Property values increase, rents go up, and poor neighborhood residents are displaced. In recent years, as a result of the impact of neoliberal urban policies, This problem has been more and more serious and has affected not only neglected neighborhood and poor residents, but entire cities and also middle class. Contemporary research say about the new urban crisis. For example, Richard Florida, an author who at the beginning new century coined the concept of creative class, in his last book titled "The New Urban Crisis: How Our City Increased Inequality," criticized neoliberal urban policy and their effect on functioning of cities.